Obviously, we want to know how that live round got on the set, but what's more important is how that live round got into the gun.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. That was Santa Fe District Attorney Mary Carmack Altwise, and she spoke to ABC News in mid-December. It's actually a quote from The Deadly Take. And what she said was that we want to know how that live round got on the set, but what they're saying is more important is how it got into the gun. How did the live round get into the gun? Curiously, ABC doesn't ask the first question the district attorney asks, which is how did the live round get on set? But what I think is a better question, why was there a live round on set? Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So I think we need to ask and answer both questions. How and why was there a live round on set? Interestingly, in The Deadly Take, although they address this question and simply confirm there was a live round and that there shouldn't be a live round, they don't make any attempt to explain why or how there was one. And I'll put a link to the Deadly Take episodes in the description. Approaching this question broadly, in reality, there wasn't just a single live round on the Rust set. There were possibly hundreds of live rounds. According to an article in Forbes, 500 rounds of ammunition were confiscated from the Rust set. I don't think it takes a rocket scientist to work out that in a scenario where you're filming lots of shooting, it's a cowboy movie after all, and you've already had 3 accidental discharges, and you have hundreds of rounds that are a mix of live and dummy rounds, sooner or later, a live round is going to go off and possibly injure or kill someone. If you consider that there were live and dummy rounds mixed since day 1 of shooting, it's a wonder it took until day 12, that's October 21st, for someone to be actually wounded and killed. It's a wonder it took that long. So I also think one needs to zoom even further away when we ask the question why and how a live round ended up on a cowboy set. I think the fact that it's a cowboy movie explains the reason why there are rounds in the first place. And I don't mean that to say it's okay to have live rounds. I'm just saying because it's not a comedy or a romance, because it's a production that's heavy on weapons and rounds, the chance of this happening is higher, not making it acceptable, but certainly that the possibility rises. And the person who's responsible for mitigating and in fact completely negating that possibility to make sure there are no live rounds is the armorer, right? So I think that the fact that it's a cowboy movie means the possibility of live rounds being on set accidentally or even intentionally rise. I think the fact that dummy rounds resemble live rounds and are done so purposefully are to give a film a sense of realism, and for the same reason, live rounds are sometimes used to practice with in order for crew or actors to get a sense of what live rounds look, sound and feel like. Whether live rounds should be on set, should ever be on set, is another matter. According to Dominic Patton, senior editor for Deadline Hollywood, live ammunition is never supposed to be on the set of a movie or television show. And I've gone and done a little bit of research because I thought maybe that's just his opinion. What does the industry say about it? And I think therein lies the rub, because what about live ammunition being used off a set? According to an article in Deadline, this is dated November 30th, quote, in a 4th search warrant approved by a New Mexico judge, detectives on Tuesday revealed the armorer Hannah Gutierrez Reed's father, Thal Reed, reached out to them November 15 to tell them about possibly hundreds of rounds of live ammunition that Rust armorer mentor Seth Kenney took from him earlier this year. Seth Kenney told the elder Reed to write it off when the veteran armorer and stuntman repeatedly inquired about the rounds. In 2 conversations with the sheriff's office, the elder Reed, that's Hannah's father, revealed that he brought the approximately 200 to 300 rounds in a can, describing the can to be green in color and looked like a military ammo can, and that this was brought to a firearms range to help train actors on another production with Seth Kenney, end quote. Remember the question we're asking ourselves: why was there a live round on set? So here you have a scenario where armorers like Thel Reed may have taken actors to shooting ranges. The question is whether the armorer has the discipline and standards to maintain good housekeeping of their arms stores. Are the dummy stores on set, for example, kept studiously free of live rounds? I think briefly we can address the question of how live rounds came onto the set of Rust by looking at the following points. Firstly, protocol. Were the Rust armorers trained in the various protocols? If you'd asked me if live rounds are permitted in film sets in America, I'd have said, I have no idea. If the armorers were asked, would they have known either way? Would the so-called armorer mentor, Seth Kenney, who recommended them, have told them? Would the issue of no live rounds on set as a rule ever have been mentioned during safety briefings by any of the crew prior to or subsequent to the accidental discharges? And that brings us to the next point, crew. An obvious reason for how live rounds got onto the set is possibly the inexperience of the armorer. Next point, the rush. Another obvious reason for how live rounds made it onto the set, possibly made it onto the set, is that someone was in too much of a hurry to notice or check. In terms of why a live round ended up on set, and that's a different question to how, I think the points are similar but not quite the same. So the first thing to bear in mind is the source. First of all, the source of the live rounds matters. Seth Kenney says he isn't the source, whereas Hannah's father seems to think he is, because he gave Seth that green can filled with live rounds. Did Seth forget about it? Next point, crew. An obvious reason for why live rounds got onto the set is possibly, again, the inexperience of the armorer. And then protocol. There are industry rules and standards, and in the research I did to do this video, I found out that there is actually a very strict protocol industry-wide, no matter what movies are being made, that there are to be no live rounds on set. As the reporter from Deadline said, it's unknown what the true protocols were on the Rust set. You know, it's almost like everybody knows the rules of the road, but it's different when you're actually out there driving. You know, what you decide, which rules apply to you. So I think it's unknown what the true protocols were on the Rust set, but it does appear that some crew members were less sensitive about safety issues than others. The fact that there were several accidental discharges followed by half a dozen members of the camera crew protesting safety and other issues seems to show things weren't as they ought to have been. Also, the fact that Helena was shot seems to not be the accidental result, but the inevitable result of a series of failures. In other words, it wasn't a random fluke. It was something that was bound to happen sooner or later. I do think the most important reason for why there was, and this is my personal opinion, I think the most important reason for why there was a live round on set is because of an intangible quality, and one that's not been mentioned anywhere so far. The stress on the day of the shooting and building up on the preceding days is what caused or helped or facilitated mistakes. Stress was a result of it being a low-budget film, possibly behind schedule, crew members quitting, coronavirus, and perhaps various personalities rubbing one another the wrong way. Can any one or a handful of producers and or crew be held responsible legally for the stress that fatally undermined the film set? It's a question. And that brings us to the second question: how did a live round end up in a gun? The question is a lot more specific, and in order to answer it, our focus has to narrow necessarily in the direction of the armorer. Who handled and loaded the Colt 45, before the scene was shot.
We identified 2 other people that handled and or inspected the loaded firearm prior to Baldwin firing the weapon. These 2 individuals are Armorer Hannah Reed Gutierrez and Assistant Director David Halls.
So that was Santa Fe Sheriff Aiden Mendoza. Now the question posed by ABC News wasn't who allowed a live round to end up in a gun, but how. I do think how and who go hand in hand. Although it's important to identify those who handled the weapon on the critical day, at the critical moment, it's also important to identify the culture around safety and the culture in general on set. In The Deadly Take, Armorer Dutch Merrick describes his protocol. He says, when we're dealing with dummy rounds, as they come out of the box, each one gets a rattle, and it's very easy to tell which is a dummy. If I picked up a dummy and it didn't rattle, I would stop. I would go, wait a second. I would isolate it from the rest of the dummy rounds. If there's any question, any anomaly, it's not going into the gun, it's not going into the film set. That's the words of Dutch Merrick, right? A film armorer. And I think what needs to be clarified here is firstly that Merrick's protocol means he checks every single round, right? Systematically. Secondly, it sounds like he checks the rounds offset before bringing them onto the set. And if he does find a round on the set, so somehow a live round does find its way on the set, then it'll be removed, right? It's quite strict because he knows he'll be fired. You'll be fired if it's found out there is a live round, right? But I do think what's quite important is this idea of checking every round before you take it onto the set. And is that what Hannah and Sarah did? Did they check the rounds from PDQ arm before bringing these rounds onto the set? Simple question. So it's unclear what the protocol was on Rust, and if there was a protocol, whether it was adhered to. It's also unclear whether the stresses and time pressures on October 21st, when tensions were really high, meant that protocols simply weren't followed or were overlooked or simply forgotten about. In ABC's The Deadly Take, it's mentioned that according to a search warrant, Assistant Director Dave Halls couldn't remember if Hannah Gutierrez Reed spun the barrel. He also apparently saw only 3 of the rounds. In short, spinning the barrel is hardly going to tell you if there are live rounds or not. Also, Halls could have checked all 6 rounds himself before handing it to Baldwin and shouting cold gun. Him seeing 3 rounds suggests Halls only sort of half-checked the firearm and only checked visually at that. It's not clear how many rounds Hannah checked, but it's possible the 6th and final round was the one round she either didn't check or didn't check properly after lunch. It would be useful to know who arrived at their posts first and last after lunch, who stayed at lunch the longest, who took the longest to finish their plate, to finish what they were drinking, to finish a conversation. Those who arrived last would have had to rush to get things ready for the rehearsal in church immediately after lunch. We also need to know whether Hannah had other obligations, since the scene actually involved Baldwin's character backing out of the church. Did that mean the 2 cowboys that had him cornered were armed and had to be provided for as well by the armorer? I think the answer to that is yes. In short, how a live round ended up in the gun may be a combination of Hannah's father's green can making its way on the set from PDQ arm, prop and arm, and the rush to get the firearm armed and ready, given that a chamber apparently needed to be cleaned at the last minute. It may also be that professional protocols weren't innate or intimately observed in this case, perhaps due to the twin issues of time pressures and a lack of experience. Another possibility, and pure speculation, is probably not the case, but certainly something that has occurred to me is, could Seth Kenny have given Hannah the green can to hand over to her father, because her father had asked for it back. So had he given it to her and said, oh, this is the can that your father wants, and possibly she had taken it but then forgotten about it. As for Dave Halls on the deadly take, his attorney went on the record to say it wasn't Halls's responsibility to confirm whether Baldwin's gun was loaded. I'm not sure that's entirely accurate, since Halls was responsible for safety, number one, and number two, since he apparently shouted, declared, announced to the other 15 people in the room inside the church, cold gun. That presupposed he did know, because he checked, didn't it? And that brings us to the final point, the final question, why did the gun go off? Interestingly, according to the Santa Fe sheriff, there are contradictory statements regarding who handed the gun to Baldwin. We touched on that in the previous episode. Dave Halls, in his statements to the authorities, denied handing Baldwin the gun. In Baldwin's interview with ABC, he doesn't mention Halls handing him the gun, but he does say,
the first AD.
Regardless of Baldwin's statement that he never pulled the trigger or that he never pointed his gun at anyone and pulled the trigger, the gun was pointed at Helena, and the gun did go off. It's likely that the trigger was pulled, in my opinion, but possible and unlikely, in my opinion, that some sort of gearing mechanism failed. I think what needs to be appreciated is the fact that not only was a live round fired, but a live gun was used. You can call it what you like, a prop, a replica. The point is the gun Baldwin had in his hand had the capacity to shoot live rounds, and it did. There is also a third possibility, which is even more remote, in my opinion, and that's the trigger was bumped somehow. It has been demonstrated that if the hammer is struck hard enough, a shot discharges. However, one imagines if this happened, someone would have seen it, and Baldwin would likely have mentioned this, because that would mitigate his position. If it's likely that Baldwin pulled the trigger, what matters potentially is what can be proved in court. If the same gun can be demonstrated failing while being cocked, or there's a significant wear and tear on the gearing mechanisms, then that may prove Baldwin's assertion that the gun essentially fired itself while in his hand. One final point. If Baldwin consciously or unconsciously pulled the trigger, it may have something to do with what actors sometimes do when they're on the spot, when all the attention is on them, when they have to perform on stage or on camera. They have to bring it and do so convincingly. While the script didn't call for Baldwin, as far as we know, to pull the trigger or to fire on anyone, it's likely that elsewhere in the script he was required to. One wonders whether there was the temptation on a set surrounded by 15 people to sort of goof around, to ad-lib, to lighten the tension, even just to experiment. And what is ad-libbing? An ad-lib is something which is said or done without having been planned or written beforehand. Every time I fluffed a line, Lenny got me out of trouble with a brilliant ad-lib. Synonyms for ad-lib, and this is from the Collins Dictionary, are improvisation, makeshift, impromptu comment, right? Is Alec Baldwin, well known as an actor who acts with improvisation? Does he have an impromptu style? What do you think? So I'm not going to take it further than that. In the next video, we're going to look at some intertextualities with another film where someone died and what were the legal repercussions of that. So if you want to catch that episode, make sure you've hit the notifications bell in order to be alerted to the next video in the series. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.